Hello and welcome back. I hope that you're doing well. If you're new around here, I go by Dana, and today I'm going to be swatching out a few different art supplies that I picked up recently. I will post the haul up in the cards, but to briefly go over it, I picked up a few different things to restock and also a few different things to fill in gaps and to try out. I currently use Winsor & Newton gouache, and I've not tried Holbein gouache before, and I needed some earth tones, so I thought that this was the perfect opportunity to combine those two things together and pick up some earth tones and also try out Holbein. I've heard really good things about Holbein, so I was pretty confident going into these that it was going to be good. And I must say I do enjoy these. I think these are very pretty earth tones. I started out with the first swatch testing how much the gouache would move into water placed next to it and gently guided in. And I didn't end up putting down too much pigment in this first swatch. Later on, when I do these again, I end up putting down way more pigment here. But even when I did put a lot more pigment down, this one doesn't really move that much. So you'll see it doesn't really move that heavily into the water. And then watch the difference when I do the same swatch again, but with the yellow ochre. I did this test because I felt like doing it at the time, if I'm completely honest. I like doing different kinds of gradients depending on my interests and needs and mood and everything at the time. And sometimes I'll do smooth gradients, especially with watercolour. Sometimes I'll want to test rough gradients with multiple layers, almost like I'm doing like a mini painting but with just that one colour. But here afterwards I ended up doing a square of the mass tone, so as much pigment as I could get down, some dry brush effects, and then also dropping the pigment into water. And even in that one you can see that it doesn't spread out too much. It spreads a little bit, but not too much. You will also notice that there's a difference between the opacity of these two. The yellow ochre is classed on the tube as fully opaque. It's got the fully coloured in circle on it, whereas the russet brown has a half coloured in circle, which means it's semi-opaque or semi-transparent, depending on the company's terminology. And you can definitely see that there's a slight difference in transparency between the two, even just looking at the mass tone swatches. It doesn't massively affect the way I paint with gouache, at least, but it's something to bear in mind when watering them down, because I do like to start off with watered down gouache sometimes rather than watercolour when I'm starting off a gouache painting. And it's also worth keeping in mind when you're building up opacity throughout the layers as well, which pigments have more opacity and transparency. It's also something you've got to keep in mind when you're doing watercolour as well, especially in my case because I like to use watercolour with ink, and I usually do the ink first, so I tend to stick more towards the transparent pigments when I'm working in watercolour, but that's an aside. And that's it for the gouache straight from the tube, which is my preferred way of using gouache. But then later I'm going to let these ones dry on the same palette, and then we will see what they're like after a few days and if they re-wet well. But now I'm going to show you the watercolors I picked up, which are actually restocks. So you'll see that I'm swatching them from my palette because these are two that I use already. You'll have seen them in some of the illustrations I've done, and you'll also have seen them when I was setting up this palette. I started off by wetting them with water and then leaving them for a few minutes, and then came back and swatched them. And this one's a little bit more of your kind of traditional gradient, but I'm using a very, very tiny brush, which isn't really ideal for doing the gradients, but we made it work. The sketchbook that I'm using for this is the Stillman and Birn Alpha series, and I found that that is a really nice cellulose sketchbook for watercolor when you're doing like just a light wash. And it's also quite nice for gouache as well. It's not watercolor paper, it is not cotton, it is not going to act like cotton watercolor paper, and it is going to buckle because of how thin the pages are. But in terms of being able to paint on a sketchbook, especially a cellulose sketchbook, I've found that the alpha isn't actually too bad. So that's what we're using for the swatches. I am going to also show the watercolor on my preferred cotton paper as well, which at the moment is Saunders Waterford. So I will be showing what this looks like on cotton paper now. And I did do an extra layer on the right, as you can see. I like doing these in order to keep track of the watercolors I have. I'm probably going to end up doing something similar for my gouache. So if you'd be interested in me doing like a little chatty painting all of my gouache onto swatch cards video, then let me know. But I do have all of my watercolor on those cards, and it helps me keep track of the watercolors that I have, but it also helps me figure out what different pigments I want to use on a palette. So you'll have seen me use them when I was setting up this palette, for example. And I have found them very, very handy over the years to also just check between different brands as well. And I didn't even mention what these are, but I did show them. I've got the burnt sienna at the top and then the bloodstone genuine underneath. And the burnt sienna is one of the first earth tones that I ever picked up in watercolor when I was starting to expand into artist grade pigments. And I've found that the Daniel Smith one has been my favorite when I've tested out different burnt siennas and PBR7s in general. The bloodstone is something that I keep going back to because I love it. It's such a gorgeous, deep. It's almost a black, but it's still got like a warmth to it underneath all of that, and the granulation on it is beautiful. So I have that on my current studio palette as well. But we're moving on to the color pencils now. So I like to use a mixture of Polychromos and Prismacolor, and I use them for different things and for different reasons to take advantage of their strengths and avoid their weaknesses. And I wanted to pick up a few new Polychromos pencils because I've really been using those ones at the moment, and I noticed that there was a few areas where I could definitely fill in some gaps. So we have started off here with Ivory. I do want to just double check that this is Ivory. It is Ivory. And I have the colour pencils next to me because I've been sketching with them today, which is a good sign that I like them if I've been sketching with them today. And then we have Cinnamon next. So as you'll notice off to the side, a lot of these are quite earthy colours. Ignoring the blue. We're going to just pretend the blue doesn't exist for a moment. These are quite earthy colours. And I noticed that earth tones was definitely an area that I was lacking in, especially when it came to the more sort of pinky violet red area of earth tones. And I also wanted to pick up a cream kind of colour, and I ended up settling on the ivory in order to have a white that wasn't too intense when working on toned paper like the paper that I'm using here, which is the Strathmore Toned Tan. And I picked up the cinnamon because I wanted a lighter, earthy tone that was more red rather than yellow, like the yellow ochre, which I believe mine isn't yellow ochre, it's called something else. Burnt ochre. So the yellow ochre that I use is actually called burnt ochre in Polychromos. And next up we have India Red. Indian reds are gorgeous earth tones in pretty much any medium I've used, so I definitely knew that that was one that I wanted to pick up. in terms of my like middle range earth tones, I do have, or I had previously, the burnt sienna, which of course is another classic earth tone, but I again felt like I wanted something a little bit more on the earthy red side, so I ended up picking up the India red. And then after that I also picked up the Caput Mortuum violet to cover the more violet kind of earth tones, and that one is a little bit darker and it works alongside my darker brown that I had already, which is walnut brown. These final two, the Caput Mortuum violet and the India red, I have been loving for sketching recently, doing line sketches, I mean. I'll show a few of them after these swatches, but I've been using them especially in my lion and big cat anatomy study sessions recently, and I've been really, really enjoying them for that. I've used them in my epsilon sketchbook for those, and then also in my art creation sketchbook that I have on the go at the moment. And the Caput Mortuum violet especially is just, I love it so much. I'm so glad I picked that one up. Next up though in the swatches we have Chromium Green Opaque. I mentioned in the haul video that I felt like I was really, really lacking when it came to earthy greens, and some of you suggested some really, really nice earth greens, so thank you so much for that. They're definitely now on my maybe get these list. I'm still undecided if I'm going to pick up any more Polychromos or if I'm going to try and go on a no-buy for a bit and work with what I have, but if I do pick up any more, those earthy greens are definitely on the list that you've suggested. And this one is really, really lovely though, and it definitely fits in the gap that I was having for the greens. So the greens that I currently have are, let me grab them out. Can't find it. Where are you? There we go. So previously I had 3 greens, now I have 4. So I had light green, emerald green, and pine green. And especially the emerald and the light green, they're very, very saturated greens. And I was finding in more and more illustrations and sketches I was doing with them that I was layering earth tones on top to try and knock them back a bit. So I feel like this Chromium Green Opaque is definitely gonna help fill that earthy green spot in my heart. And a similar case with the blue here. I was pretty much only using one light earth blue. Light earth blue? I've been saying earth too much, so now blues are earth tones, I'm afraid. I have changed color theory. Blue is now an earth tone. I was originally just using the light ultramarine as my light blue, but I was wanting something a little on the cooler end, so I ended up picking up the light cobalt turquoise, and that's fit in perfectly. But here you can see the lion studies I was doing with the Caput Mortuum violets, and like I said, I've been really, really enjoying using that for sketching, especially in my epsilon. And here are also what all of these look like on the epsilon paper as well. The epsilon doesn't have as much texture as the art, not the art creation, as the alpha. This is the problem when you use so many sketchbooks at once. I did also swatch the color pencils on the alpha paper as well, which you'll be able to see at the end. Now we have the gouache dry. This is what the swatches look like, and we also have the gouache dry on the palette as well. So we're going to be going into swatches of them dry, but I'm starting off first by putting some water on them and just letting them reactivate a little bit. And these reactivate beautifully. They definitely cracked on the palette, as you probably saw when I showed you the close-up. So I reckon, like most gouache, they're probably going to crumble unless you do some fancy shenanigans with them, because I know some people will put in, I think it's glycerin and clove oil and things into their gouache to try and make them dry but not crack and things like that. But I haven't ever tried doing any of that. It doesn't appeal to me at the moment in my art practice. But as you can see, the yellow ochre re-wet beautifully. It's gone down pretty much the same. I'll definitely say that it isn't quite as opaque as it is fresh from the tube, but it's very impressive for a few days later. And similar thing with the russet brown, you can definitely tell, especially in the mass tone square, that it's not quite as opaque, but you get a really good, what is it, color payoff pigment load from reactivating these from dry. Again, not my favorite way of using gouache, but it's good to know because I will sometimes use leftovers on a palette to work on a new painting as well sometimes, especially for the beginning layers that are usually much less opaque. And it's good to know that they'll at least re-wet without just crumbling to pieces like some other gouache can unfortunately do. With the from dry tests, I definitely tried to give the russet brown a little bit more love and actually try to make the first swatch opaque with it, or at least have more pigment load than I did in the initial. And it is a lovely brown. It's a little bit different from other PR 101s I've come across, at least in watercolor. I'm not as familiar with PR 101 as I am using PBR 7, your burnt sienna, your burnt umber. I tend to use those a lot more, especially in watercolor. But when going through Holbein's list of earth tones, I ended up settling on the russet brown one because, at least online, it looked really pretty. And also because I wanted to try and stick to a single pigment brown. I know with the yellow ochre, it's two pigments, but the two pigments are very similar. You'll find yellow ochres using either one of those, PY1, PY43 and PY42. So it didn't bother me too much that it had both of those in it, but I didn't really want to deal with like a PBR 7 with a PBK and some other pigments mixed in as well. So I wanted to try and stick to a single pigment, at least for the brown. And looking through all the single pigment ones, the russet brown looked really, really nice. And I'm really glad that I picked that one up. It's gorgeous. It reminds me a lot of the PBR 25, I believe it is, that I use in watercolor. The brown red, red brown from Shinhan is the one that I'm using at the moment in my main palette. This reminds me a lot of that, but a little bit darker, a little bit more on the burnt umber side of how dark it can go. And overall, I'm really, really happy with these two choices. And this is what they look like side by side and up close. You can see a little bit of separation in the russet brown, which is interesting. It separates almost into like a more reddy color and then an almost more black kind of color. And you can see it a little bit in the watered down bit of the gradient, and you can also see it where it's been dropped into water. It starts to split a little bit, which is really interesting, and I'm all for textures in my paintings at the moment, so it doesn't bother me too much. But here are all of the different swatches. I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know in the comments what you've been up to recently in your art practices, and I'll see you next time. Bye!